The walls of the institution were painted in muted colors, meant to soothe, but to her they felt like a cage disguised as care. She had been brought there under the guise of concern, her father's voice calm and authoritative as he explained to the staff that she was unstable, that her rebellion was a symptom of something darker. They nodded, believing him without question, their pens scratching across intake forms as though her fate could be reduced to neat lines of ink. When she tried to speak, to explain that it was all a lie, her words were met with polite smiles and dismissive glances, as though her truth was nothing more than the ramblings of a troubled mind. The betrayal cut deeper than the confinement itself. It wasn't the locked doors or the sterile hallways that broke her. It was the realization that her father had weaponized her voice, turning her truth into evidence of delusion. Every word she spoke in defense of herself was twisted, reframed as proof of instability. If she cried, it was hysteria. If she grew quiet, it was withdrawal. If she grew angry, it was aggression. There was no way to win, no way to be heard, because the narrative had already been written, and she had been cast as the unreliable narrator of her own life. She watched the staff move around her with clinical detachment, their kindness laced with condescension. They spoke to her in soft tones, as though she were fragile glass, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They did not believe her. They believed him, the man who had burned her belongings, who had twisted her words, who had stolen her voice, was now the trusted authority while she was reduced to a case file, a diagnosis waiting to be stamped across her identity. The injustice of it pressed against her chest like a weight she could not lift. Nights were the hardest. In the silence of her room, she replayed the fire, the smoke, the whispers of relatives who had nodded along with his lies. She thought of the journals that had been stolen, the fragments of herself that had been consumed in flames. And now, here she was, stripped of even the right to speak. The institution was not just a place of confinement. It was an echo of her father's control, a physical manifestation of the silence he had imposed on her. The walls hummed with his authority, even in his absence. She tried to write, to capture her thoughts on scraps of paper, but even that was monitored. Her words read and interpreted through the lens of suspicion. Every sentence she formed was no longer her own. It was evidence, fuel for the narrative he had created. She felt herself shrinking, her voice dissolving into the sterile air, her truth buried beneath layers of clinical jargon. The betrayal was not just that he had confined her, but that he had stolen the very tools she needed to fight back. Her father visited once, his presence filling the room with the same suffocating authority she had always known. He spoke to the staff with ease, his words smooth, his tone measured, painting himself as the concerned parent doing everything he could for his troubled daughter. She sat across from him, her fists clenched, her throat burning with words she could not speak. When she tried, he silenced her with a single look, the same look that had always reduced her to silence. And the staff, blind to the cruelty beneath his calm exterior, nodded in approval. The days blurred together, each one a repetition of the last, each one a reminder that her truth had been erased. She began to wonder if she was losing herself, if the silence imposed on her would eventually seep into her bones and make her forget who she was. The thought terrified her, but it also fueled a quiet defiance. She would not let him win, not completely. Even if her voice was dismissed, even if her truth was buried, she would carry it inside her, waiting for the moment she could finally let it out. When she was finally released, it was not because they believed her, but because they believed she was stabilized. The word tasted bitter, a label that suggested she had been broken and repaired, when in truth she had never been broken at all. She walked out of the institution with the weight of their disbelief pressing against her, but also with a fire burning quietly inside her. They had silenced her, but they had not destroyed her. The betrayal lingered long after she left, a shadow that followed her into every interaction, every attempt to speak her truth. She knew now that her father's power was not just in his rage, but in his ability to convince others that she was the problem. That realization cut deeper than any confinement, because it meant the world itself could be turned against her with nothing more than his words. The silence he had imposed was not just physical, it was systemic, woven into the fabric of how others saw her. And yet, beneath the weight of that silence, she carried a seed of defiance. The institution had taught her that her voice could be dismissed, but it had also taught her that silence could be a weapon of its own. She would bide her time, gather her strength, and one day she would speak in a way that could not be ignored. The betrayal had carved scars into her, but it had also carved resolve. And though her father had tried to erase her, she knew now that she would not let herself disappear. The fight for her freedom began not with a dramatic outburst, but with quiet determination. She started collecting scraps of evidence wherever she could, copies of her own diaries that she had hidden away, notes from teachers who had praised her work, and testimonies from friends who had witnessed her father's controlling behavior. Each piece was small on its own, but together they began to form a picture that contradicted the story he had spun. It was painstaking work, done in secret, each step carrying the risk of discovery. But she pressed on, fueled by the knowledge that her truth deserved to be heard. Her mentor entered her life at the moment she needed it. Most, a former teacher who had always seen her potential and refused to believe the lies whispered about her. This mentor became her anchor, guiding her through the labyrinth of legal procedures, teaching her how to turn her pain into testimony. With their help, she learned how to frame her experiences not as the ramblings of a troubled girl, but as evidence of systematic manipulation. For the first time, she felt her voice sharpen into something undeniable, something that could cut through the web of deceit her father had woven. The courtroom was a place she had once feared, a stage where she imagined her father's authority would crush her again. But when the day came, she walked in with her head high, her mentor at her side, her evidence carefully organized. Her father sat across from her, dressed in the respectability he had always worn like armor, his expression calm, confident, certain that his reputation would shield him. But beneath that calm, she saw the flicker of unease, the first crack in the mask he had worn for so long. When she took the stand, her voice trembled at first, but it did not falter. She spoke of the journals, of the fire, of the institution, each word a stone laid carefully into the foundation of her truth. She presented the evidence she had gathered, each piece dismantling the narrative he had built. The courtroom listened, and for the first time, she was not dismissed, not silenced, not erased. Her words carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they were true. Her father tried to defend himself, his voice smooth, his arguments rehearsed, but the evidence was too strong. The contradictions in his story became clear, the manipulations too obvious to ignore. Witnesses stepped forward, friends, teachers, even distant relatives, each one adding their voice to hers, each one chipping away at the image of the respectable father he had so carefully constructed. The mask he had worn for years began to crumble, piece by piece, under the weight of the truth. The verdict was not just a legal victory, it was a reclamation of her voice. When the judge declared him guilty of falsification and abuse, the words rang in her ears like a bell, clear and undeniable. The courtroom murmured. The image of the untouchable patriarch shattered in an instant. She sat in silence, her hands trembling, tears burning her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being believed. Her father's face, once so commanding, was pale and hollow as the sentence was read. He looked at her with something she had never seen before. Not rage, not authority, but fear. Fear of the truth, fear of the consequences, fear of the daughter he had tried to erase. She met his gaze steadily, no longer the silenced child, but the young woman who had fought her way back into her own story. When she left the courtroom, the air outside felt different, lighter, freer, as though the world itself had shifted. She was not naive. She knew the scars of what he had done would remain, that healing would be a long and uneven road. But she also knew that she had taken back something he could never steal again, her credibility, her agency, her voice. Her mentor walked beside her, their presence steady, their pride unspoken but palpable. She realized then that she was no longer alone, no longer trapped in the narrative her father had written for her. She had allies, she had proof, and most importantly, she had herself. The silence he had imposed was broken, and in its place was a voice that could not be dismissed. And though the battle had left her weary, she carried with her a clarity that burned brighter than the fire he had once used to destroy her. He had tried to erase her, but in the end, it was his image that had been reduced to ash. She walked away from the courthouse not as a victim, but as a survivor, her steps steady, her future her own to claim. The day of the conviction arrived with a weight that pressed against her chest, heavier than she had imagined. She sat in the courtroom, her palms damp, her heart pounding as the judge's words cut through the silence. Guilty. The sound was final, echoing in her ears like a bell tolling the end of an era. Her father, once untouchable in the eyes of the family and community, now stood exposed, his carefully constructed image shattered in front of everyone. She should have felt triumphant, but the victory was laced with sorrow, because no sentence could undo the years of silence. No verdict could return the pieces of herself that had been burned away. The family fractured almost immediately, the ripple of the judgment spreading like cracks through glass. Some relatives clung to him, insisting he had been misunderstood, that the system had failed him, that she had been manipulated into turning against her own blood. Others avoided her altogether, their silence a cowardly shield against choosing sides. A few quietly offered her support, but even their words were tinged with hesitation, as though they feared the weight of aligning themselves with her truth. The fracture was permanent, and she knew it. She walked out of the courthouse with her mentor at her side, the autumn air sharp against her skin. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, but she kept her gaze forward, refusing to let the chaos pull her back into the role of spectacle. She had spoken, she had been believed, and the law had recognized the truth she had carried for so long. Yet, beneath the relief was a hollow ache, the knowledge that justice did not erase scars. It only acknowledged them. Her father's face lingered in her mind, pale and hollow as the verdict was read. He had looked at her not with rage, but with something worse. Disbelief that she had managed to break free of his control. That look haunted her, not because it frightened her, but because it revealed the depth of his arrogance, the certainty he had always carried that she would never escape. Seeing that certainty crumble was a victory, but it was also a reminder of how much he had stolen before she could reach this moment. The whispers of the family followed her long after the trial ended. At gatherings she no longer attended, her name was spoken in hushed tones, her story twisted into cautionary tales. Some called her brave, others called her ungrateful, but all of them carried the same unease. She had broken the silence, and in doing so, she had broken the illusion of safety they had all clung to. She had forced them to see the cracks in the foundation, and many would never forgive her for it. At night she lay awake, the verdict replaying in her mind, mingling with the memories of fire and confinement. The scars were not visible, but they pulsed beneath her skin, reminders of the years she had been silenced. She knew healing would not come quickly, that the wounds would reopen in unexpected ways, but she also knew she had reclaimed something vital. Her voice was no longer a weapon in his hands. It was hers, sharpened by survival, strengthened by truth. Her mentor reminded her often that justice was not the same as closure. The conviction was a milestone, not an ending, and she carried that truth with her as she tried to rebuild. She poured herself into her work, into her art, into the fragments of identity she had salvaged from the ashes. Each step forward was both liberation and reminder, victory and scar, proof that survival was not clean but jagged, not simple but layered. The fracture in the family never healed, and she stopped expecting it to. She learned to live without their approval, without their presence, without the illusion of belonging. In their absence, she found space to create her own circle, people who believed her without hesitation, who saw her not as broken, but as whole. That circle became her family, not by blood, but by choice, and in their presence she began to feel the weight of the past lift, piece by piece. Still, there were moments when the scars ached, when she smelled smoke, when she heard the word unstable whispered in passing, when she saw fathers and daughters laughing together in ways she had never known. Those moments reminded her that victory did not erase loss, that justice did not restore what had been taken. But they also reminded her of her strength, of the fire she had walked through and survived. And so she carried both, the victory and the scars, woven together into the fabric of who she had become. She did not pretend the scars weren't there, nor did she let them define her. They were proof of survival, proof of defiance, proof that she had faced the man who tried to erase her and walked away with her voice intact. The conviction was not the end of her story, but it was the moment she claimed it as her own, and in that claim, she found a clarity that no one could ever take from her again. The city she chose was nothing like the one she had left behind. Its streets were wide and unfamiliar, its skyline jagged with possibility. Here, no one knew her name. No one whispered her father's lies. No one looked at her with suspicion. She rented a small apartment with peeling paint and a single window that caught the morning light, and for the first time in years, she felt the fragile beginnings of freedom. It wasn't grand, but it was hers, and that alone made it sacred. She rebuilt herself piece by piece, carving out a life that was not defined by the ashes of what had been taken. She worked long hours, saved what she could, and poured her soul into writing. Words became her salvation, her rebellion, her proof that her voice could not be silenced. She filled notebooks with stories, essays, fragments of memory, each page a reclamation of the identity her father had tried to erase. In the quiet of her apartment, she created worlds where she was not the victim, but the author, where her truth was not dismissed, but immortalized. Her art grew alongside her independence. She painted canvases that dripped with color, bold and unrestrained, as though she were daring the world to look away. She found friends who admired her work, who saw her not as broken but as brilliant, and slowly she began to believe them. She laughed more freely, spoke more boldly, and allowed herself to imagine a future that was not haunted by the past. And yet, the past lingered. The memory of the fire, of her belongings curling into ash, clung to her like smoke in her lungs. Sometimes, when she opened a notebook, she could almost smell the charred paper, could almost hear the crackle of flames devouring her words. The stolen years pressed against her in quiet moments, when she saw fathers walking with daughters in the park, when she passed a bookstore and thought of the journals she had lost, when she woke in the night with the echo of his voice still ringing in her ears. The scars were invisible, but they shaped her all the same. She carried them into every success, every triumph, every moment of joy. They reminded her that freedom was not something given, but something fought for, something claimed. And though the memories ached, they also fueled her, pushing her to create, to thrive, to prove that she was more than what he had tried to make her. 5 years passed in this rhythm, building, creating, healing, but never forgetting. She had carved out a life that was hers alone, a life defined not by his lies, but by her truth. And yet, beneath the surface, the smoke still lingered, a reminder that the past was not gone, only waiting. She did not know when or how it would return, but she felt it, like a storm gathering at the edge of the horizon. For now, though, she breathed in the air of her chosen city, her lungs filling with something freer than smoke. She wore her independence like armor, her creativity like a banner, and her scars like proof of survival. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes, and though the memory of the fire still haunted her, it no longer defined her. She was not erased. She was alive, and she was writing her own story. The envelope was thin, unremarkable, the kind of thing that could have been mistaken for junk mail if not for the way her stomach dropped the moment she saw the handwriting. She froze on the threshold of her apartment, the morning sun spilling across the floor, the rest of the world moving as usual while her own seemed to stop. The loops of the letters, the sharpness of the strokes, she knew them instantly. It was his. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open, the paper crackling like a whisper of the past she had tried so hard to bury. Inside there was no explanation, no apology, no attempt at justification. Just a single line, written in the same hand that had once signed her into silence. "I want to see you before it's too late." The words were stark, almost desperate, and yet they carried the same weight of control he had always wielded. They were not a question, not a request, but a summons cloaked in fragility. She read them again and again, her chest tightening with every repetition. Too late for what? Too late for him? Too late for her? The ambiguity gnawed at her, pulling her back into the orbit of a man she had spent 5 years escaping. The letter smelled faintly of smoke, or perhaps that was her imagination, her mind conjuring the scent of burning paper, of the fire that had consumed her belongings and rewritten her life. She felt the old ache return, the phantom weight of the years stolen from her, the scars carved into her voice. And yet beneath the anger there was something else, an unease she could not name, a flicker of curiosity she wished she could extinguish. She folded the letter carefully, as though it might crumble in her hands, and set it on the table. The apartment around her, once a sanctuary, now felt invaded, the walls closing in with the reminder that the past was not finished with her. She had built a life of independence, of creation, of survival, but the letter was proof that he still existed, still reached for her, still believed he had the right to summon her back into his story. Her breath came shallow, her pulse quickening as she stared at the single line. It was not forgiveness he sought. She knew that instinctively. It was something else, something she could not yet name. And though every part of her wanted to tear the letter to shreds, to burn it as he had burned her, she could not bring herself to do it. Instead, she left it on the table, its presence heavy, its silence louder than any scream. The letter had arrived like a ghost at her door, and with it came the truth she had always feared. The past was not finished, and neither was he. The visiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant, its walls a sterile white that seemed designed to strip away any trace of humanity. She sat at the metal table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her breath shallow as the door opened. When he entered, she almost didn't recognize him. His shoulders were stooped, his hair thinner, his skin sallow with age. The man who had once towered over her life, who had burned her belongings and silenced her voice, now looked diminished, hollowed out by time. And yet, when his eyes met hers, she felt the same piercing intensity she had known all her life, an intensity that had once terrified her, but now only unsettled. He lowered himself into the chair across from her, his movements slow, deliberate, as though every gesture carried the weight of years. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until finally his voice broke it, hoarse, trembling, but still carrying the cadence of authority. "I destroyed you," he said, the words falling like stones between them. "I destroyed your life. And I did it out of fear." Her chest tightened, her nails digging into her palms. She had imagined this moment countless times, imagined him denying, deflecting, raging. She had never imagined him confessing. He leaned forward, his hands trembling on the table. "I was afraid of losing control, afraid of your independence, afraid that if you didn't need me, I would disappear, that I would be forgotten." His voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time, she saw not the tyrant who had silenced her, but the man beneath, the man who had built his cruelty on a foundation of terror. The admission did not soften her anger, it sharpened it. Because fear did not excuse the fire, the lies, the years stolen from her. Fear did not erase the nights she had spent locked away, her voice dismissed as delusion. Fear did not return the journals, the sketches, the fragments of herself he had burned to ash. His confession was not redemption, it was exposure, the unmasking of the weakness that had always driven his strength. She studied him, her silence deliberate, her gaze steady. He shifted under it, his hands restless, his breath uneven. For once he was the one unraveling, his words spilling out not as commands but as pleas. "I thought if I broke you, I could keep you. I thought if I silenced you, you would stay. But I was wrong. I see that now." Her throat ached with the weight of everything she wanted to say, everything she had carried for years. She wanted to tell him that his fear had not just broken her, it had broken them, shattered the bond that could never be repaired. She wanted to tell him that his confession came too late, that the damage was already carved into her bones. But for now, she let the silence speak. Let him sit in the truth of his own words. The sterile room seemed to close in around them, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space where his authority had once lived. He was older, diminished, stripped of the power he had wielded so easily. And yet in his eyes, she still saw the man who had tried to erase her. His confession was not enough to undo the past, but it was enough to reveal the truth she had always known. His cruelty had never been about her weakness, but about his fear, and in that revelation, she felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but clarity. He had admitted what she had always suspected, and now the weight of it was his to carry, not hers. She sat straighter, her silence no longer imposed but chosen, her presence no longer fragile but unshakable. For the first time, she realized that the confrontation was not about what he would say, but about what she would no longer allow. He had confessed his fear, and in doing so, he had revealed the truth. She was never the broken one. He was... She arrived at the sterile visiting room with something clutched tightly in her bag. Not a gift, not an olive branch, but the fragments of a past he had tried to erase. When she sat across from him, his eyes searching hers with that same desperate intensity, she did not speak right away. Instead, she reached into the bag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Her hands were steady as she unfolded it, revealing the charred remains of diary pages she had salvaged years ago from the fire he had set. The edges were blackened, the words half consumed, but enough remained to remind her of what had been stolen. His eyes widened, his breath catching as he recognized them. For a moment, his hand twitched as though he might reach across the table, reclaim them, rewrite the story once more. But she stopped him with a look, her gaze sharp, unflinching. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the bundle on the table between them. The sound was soft, but it carried the weight of everything he had done. "This is what you left me with," she said, her voice calm, steady, unshaken. "I can't rewrite it for you." The words landed heavier than any accusation, heavier than any scream. They were not just about the pages. They were about the years, the silence, the scars. The fragments on the table were proof of his cruelty, proof of the identity he had tried to burn away. They were the evidence of her survival, but also of the damage that could never be undone. He stared at the pages, his face crumpling, his hands trembling as though the sight of them was more unbearable than the verdict that had once condemned him. His lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, he seemed to understand that there was nothing she could give him, nothing she could repair on his behalf. The brokenness was his to carry, not hers. She leaned back in her chair, her silence deliberate, her presence unyielding. The charred pages remained between them, a boundary that could not be crossed, a reminder that some things are meant to stay broken. She had carried them for years, but now she was setting them down, not as an offering, not as forgiveness, but as truth. The room felt colder, the hum of the fluorescent lights louder as he lowered his gaze to the table. His shoulders sagged, his authority gone, his power dissolved. She did not soften, did not reach across to comfort him. This was not about his healing. This was about hers. By placing the pages on the table, she had returned the weight to where it belonged. She would not rewrite the story he had tried to destroy. She would not carry his guilt, his fear, his regret. The choice was hers now, and she had chosen clarity over reconciliation, truth over illusion. And in that moment, she realized that she no longer needed to hold on to the fragments. They were not her burden anymore. They were his. She rose from the table, leaving the bundle of charred diary pages where they lay, their blackened edges a silent testimony to everything he had tried to erase. He stared at them as though they were a mirror, forcing him to see the wreckage of his own making. She did not wait for him to speak again. His words, his fear, his regret were no longer hers to carry. The sterile visiting room seemed to dissolve behind her as she stepped into the corridor, her breath steady, her stride unbroken. For 5 years she had rebuilt herself from ashes, and now she understood. She did not need his apology, his recognition, or his permission to move forward. What she needed was already hers, her voice, her truth, her future. That evening, back in her apartment, she opened a small velvet box her mentor had given her on the day of the trial. Inside lay a necklace, simple but luminous, its chain unbroken, its pendant gleaming softly in the lamplight. She lifted it carefully, feeling its weight in her palm. Unlike the charred fragments she had left behind, this was not a relic of destruction, but a symbol of survival, of choice. She clasped it around her neck, the cool metal resting against her skin like a vow. In the mirror, she saw not the silenced girl of the past, not the victim of his fire, but the woman who had endured, who had spoken, who had chosen. The necklace caught the light, a quiet gleam that seemed to whisper of beginnings rather than endings. Her father's shadow would always exist, but it no longer defined her. The burned pages were his legacy. The new necklace was hers. She touched it lightly, her fingers steady, and felt clarity settle into her bones. She had walked away not with forgiveness, but with freedom. And as the night stretched on, she sat at her desk, pen in hand, a blank page before her. This time, her words would not be stolen, twisted, or burned. They would be hers alone, written into a future she had claimed for herself. The story closed not with reconciliation, but with resolution, a daughter no longer bound by the lies of her father, but defined by the truth she chose to live. From burning pages to courtroom battles, her father's lies couldn't survive the voice. He tried to erase at 16. She had believed her bedroom was the only place in the world that belonged entirely to her, a sanctuary where her thoughts could spill freely onto paper without judgment. But the illusion shattered the day she stumbled upon the locked drawer in her father's study, the one he guarded with an intensity that had always unsettled her. Inside, she found a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages filled not with his handwriting but with her own words, copied, twisted, and rearranged into a grotesque version of her life. Every private note she had ever written, every confession she had tucked away in her diary, had been stolen and rewritten as evidence of her supposed delinquency. The betrayal was suffocating, a violation so intimate it felt like her very thoughts had been stripped bare and weaponized against her. The entries were not just records, but distortions. Her father's hand reshaping her teenage frustrations into accusations of rebellion, her dreams into signs of instability, her independence into proof of corruption. A line about wanting to leave home one day became a declaration of hatred for her family. A note about feeling lonely was reframed as proof of dangerous tendencies. Each page was a mirror warped beyond recognition, reflecting not who she was, but who he wanted others to believe she had become. The realization that he had been watching her so closely, stealing her words and twisting them into lies, left her breathless with a mixture of rage and terror. She remembered the way her father had always looked at her, his gaze sharp and assessing, as though he were waiting for her to slip. Now she understood why. He had been building a case against her all along, a narrative that painted him as the vigilant protector and her as the wayward child. The journal was not just a record, but a weapon, one he could wield to control her, to silence her, to convince others that she was broken. The thought of how long he had been doing this, how many of her private moments had been stolen and twisted, made her skin crawl. Her hands shook as she turned the pages, each one a deeper violation than the last. She saw her own handwriting copied word for word, then followed by his annotations in the margins, cold and clinical, as if she were a specimen under observation. Unstable. Defiant. Corrupted. The words leapt off the page, branding her with labels she had never chosen, stripping her of the right to define herself. It was not just surveillance, it was erasure, the rewriting of her identity by the very man who was supposed to protect it. The betrayal cut deeper than any punishment he had ever given her. This was not discipline. It was a theft of her voice, a rewriting of her truth. She felt the walls of the study closing in, the air thick with the weight of his control. The journal in her hands was more than paper and ink. It was proof that her father had never seen her as a daughter, but as a subject to be monitored, corrected, and contained. The realization left her trembling, her heart pounding with the knowledge that she had been living under a microscope she had never consented to. She wanted to scream, to tear the pages apart, to burn the journal and scatter its ashes to the wind. But even in her fury, she knew that destroying it would not erase the damage it had already done. The lies it contained were too carefully constructed, too insidious, ready to be unleashed at any moment. She could almost hear his voice, calm and authoritative, presenting the journal as evidence of her delinquency, convincing anyone who listened that she was unstable, untrustworthy, unfit to be believed. The thought made her stomach twist with dread. The discovery left her with a choice she was not ready to make: confront him and risk his wrath, or keep silent and let the weight of his lies grow heavier with time. At 16, she was still learning the shape of her own voice, still struggling to claim her identity in a world that wanted to define it for her. Now, even that fragile process had been stolen, replaced by a narrative she had never written. The journal was not just a betrayal, it was a prison, one that threatened to lock her inside a version of herself that was not her own. She slipped the journal back into the drawer, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. The knowledge of its existence burned in her chest, a secret too heavy to carry but too dangerous to reveal. Every glance from her father now felt sharper, every word laced with the threat of exposure. She could not unsee what she had found, could not return to the illusion of safety she had once believed in. The walls of her home, once familiar, now felt hostile, each corner hiding the possibility of another violation. That night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the words she had read. The labels he had given her clung to her skin like a second shadow, whispering doubts she could not silence. She felt stripped of her privacy, her autonomy, her very sense of self. The journal was not just a record of her life, it was a rewriting of it, a theft of her identity that left her wondering if anyone would ever believe her truth over his lies. And as the hours stretched into dawn, she realized that this discovery was not the end of something, but the beginning. The journal was a weapon, and her father had already shown he was willing to use it. The question was not if he would, but when, and in that realization, she felt the first stirrings of a resolve she had never known before, a determination to one day reclaim her voice, no matter how deeply he tried to bury it beneath his pages. The confrontation began with trembling words, her voice breaking as she demanded to know why he had stolen her diaries, why he had twisted her private thoughts into lies. For a moment she thought he might deny it, might try to soothe her with the calm authority he always wielded. Instead, his face hardened, his eyes narrowing with a fury that seemed to ignite the air around them. Without hesitation, he stormed into her room, tearing through drawers and shelves, gathering her journals, sketches, and letters, every piece of herself she had ever dared to keep private. She followed him into the backyard, her heart pounding. As he piled them high like kindling, the fire roared to life with a violence that mirrored his voice. He screamed that she was corrupted, that her words were poison, that her very existence had been tainted by rebellion. The flames devoured her belongings, pages curling into ash, ink dissolving into smoke that stung her eyes. She stood frozen, the heat searing her skin as he declared that she must be erased, that the girl she had been was already gone. Each item that burned was a piece of her identity, a fragment of her truth, consumed in a blaze meant to silence her forever. Neighbors peeked over fences. Relatives whispered from the porch, but no one intervened. Instead, they listened as he framed her defiance as instability, his voice carrying with the authority of a man who had always been believed. He spoke of her as though she were a danger to herself, a danger to others, a girl unraveling under the weight of her own mind. His words spread like smoke, filling the ears of those who wanted to believe him, those too afraid to question the image of the father who had always stood tall in their eyes. She tried to speak, to shout over the crackle of the fire, but her voice was drowned out by his performance. He painted her as ungrateful, unstable, corrupted by influences she could not name. He told them she was slipping, that she needed to be controlled, that her rebellion was not strength, but sickness. And as the flames consumed the last of her belongings, she realized that the fire was not just meant to destroy her things, it was meant to destroy her credibility, to reduce her truth to ash before anyone could hear it. The betrayal was complete not in the burning itself, but in the way the crowd nodded, the way their eyes shifted from her to him, choosing his narrative over hers. She saw it in their faces, the doubt, the pity, the quiet agreement that she was dangerous, that she was broken. Her father had not just stolen her words, he had stolen her voice, twisting it into something unrecognizable, something that made her a stranger in her own family. The fire was his weapon, but their silence was his shield. The smell of smoke clung to her hair, her clothes, her skin, as though it had seeped into her very being. She felt hollow, stripped of everything that had once been hers, everything that had once defined her. The journals, the sketches, the letters, they had been her proof of existence, her way of carving herself into the world. Now they were gone, reduced to ash at the hands of the man who claimed to love her. The betrayal was not just in the act, but in the message, that her truth was disposable, that her identity could be burned away. Her father's voice rang out one last time, declaring her a danger, declaring her corrupted, declaring her erased. The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring their agreement, their eyes avoiding hers. She stood alone in the smoke, her throat raw, her chest heavy, her silence forced upon her by the weight of their belief in him. The fire died down, leaving only embers, but the damage was done. She had been branded not by her own actions, but by his lies. That night she lay awake, the smell of smoke still clinging to her, the image of her belongings turning to ash replaying endlessly in her mind. She felt stripped bare, her identity stolen, her truth rewritten. The betrayal was not just personal. It was public, a performance staged for all to see, a rewriting of her story in flames. And as she stared into the darkness, she realized that the fire had not just destroyed her past, it had set the stage for the battle that was still to come. The next morning, whispers spread through the family, each one echoing his words. They spoke of her as unstable, as dangerous, as someone who needed to be watched. The betrayal had taken root, growing in the soil of their silence, watered by their willingness to believe him. She felt the walls closing in, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her, suffocating her voice before she could even speak. The fire had burned her belongings, but the lies had burned her place in the family, and yet, beneath the ashes, something stirred. The betrayal had cut deep, but it had also revealed the truth she could no longer ignore. He would never see her as herself, only as the version he could control. The fire had destroyed her belongings, but it had also destroyed any illusion that she could ever be safe in his shadow. And in that realization, she felt the first flicker of defiance, a spark that would one day grow into a blaze of her own.